The first time I saw Cesare Corsini smile, a silver tray lay upside down on his marble floor, and every armed man in the room forgot how to breathe. I was the new maid, 36, a napkin in my fist and no idea what I had just done. He was a godfather who had not smiled in 14 years. Then I said 5 Sicilian words my father taught me, and he laughed out loud. 30 seconds later he heard my name, and the smile died like a snuffed candle. I wish I could tell you I said those words on purpose, that I knew what doors they would open. I didn't. I was just a broke woman on her first shift, cleaning up a stranger's accident the way my father had taught me to forgive small disasters. But the way that room went silent told me 2 things at once. My father had known these people, and whatever had passed between them 14 years ago was still sharp enough to stop a godfather's heart. To understand why 5 little words could do that, you have to understand how far I had fallen to be standing in that dining room at all. Because 6 months earlier, I had a career, an apartment, and a future I believed in. Then a man I loved signed my name to a dream that collapsed, and when the dust settled, I had lost everything except my pride, my mother, and my father's old sayings. His name was Dante, and for 2 years I believed he was my reward for surviving a childhood without a father. He was opening a restaurant in Hoboken, he said, and the landlord needed a second signature on the lease. Mine. Just a formality, he promised, between 2 people building a life. The restaurant died in 11 months. Dante vanished in the 12th. The lease, the penalties, and the lawyers all came looking for the only person they could still find, me. I was college-educated, for whatever that was worth. I had managed offices and kept books for a medical practice for 9 years, and none of it mattered once the judgments started eating my paychecks. I sold my furniture piece by piece. I moved to a smaller apartment, then a worse one, then one where the heat came and went like an unreliable friend. By spring, my landlord slid an envelope under my door and gave me 30 days. My mother offered me her spare room in Hackensack, and I loved her too much to take it. Bianca Marchetti was 63, still working clerical shifts, still standing straight after my father walked out on us 14 years ago. She had rebuilt her life from nothing once already. I was not going to move back in and become the second person to make her small. So I swallowed my pride and called every domestic agency in northern New Jersey. That is how I ended up driving my wheezing Corolla through iron gates in Alpine, New Jersey, where the mansions hide behind stone walls and old trees. The agency called it an emergency live-in position. Good pay, room and board, start immediately. What they did not explain was why the 2 men at the gate looked at my dented bumper like it was a weapon, or why they never asked my name. They already knew it. The estate was called Villa Corsini, and the man who ran its household was Salvatore Greco, a 72-year-old steward with a posture like a church candle. He walked me through the rules the way other men recite prayers, slowly, and expecting them to be obeyed. The east wing was Mr. Emilio's. The garden floor belonged to the old Don, Cesare Corsini, and the old Don did not like noise, strangers, or questions, especially questions. I asked anyway. I asked who I would be serving breakfast to, and Salvatore's hands went still on the linen he was folding. He told me that Cesare Corsini had once been the most feared man in the New York families, that his nephew Emilio ran everything now, and that the old man had not smiled, truly smiled, in 14 years. He said it the way you mention a death in the family. The next morning, I carried the coffee service into a sunroom that smelled of lemon trees and money. Cesare Corsini sat at the head of a long table in a pale linen jacket, 79 years old, thin as a blade, with eyes that had clearly ended arguments without a sound. Emilio stood by the window reviewing documents. 53, silver at the temples, handsome in the way a locked door is handsome. Salvatore reached for a porcelain cup, and his hand, which had steadied this house for 40 years, chose that morning to betray him. The tray tipped. Porcelain hit marble like gunfire, and coffee bled across the floor, while every man in that room froze in terror of what the old Don might do. Cesare did not move, he did not blink. He simply watched Salvatore's shame spread across the tile like a stain that would never lift. My mouth acted before my fear did. I knelt with the napkin and said the words my father used whenever something went wrong in our kitchen. Kumansia fa muduki, who eats makes crumbs. It means every action leaves a trace, and no mess is the end of the world. The room went dead quiet, and then Cesar Corsini laughed. A real laugh, rusty and startled, like an engine turning over after years in the cold. Salvatore crossed himself. I am not joking. A man who had served coffee through gang wars crossed himself over a dropped cup, because his godfather had just made a sound no one in that house had heard in 14 years. Emilio lowered his papers an inch, and his eyes fixed on me the way you look at a weapon someone has set on the table, curious and cold, wondering who loaded it and why. If an old man's laugh can make hardened men cross themselves, you know this story is worth your time. Hit the like button and subscribe right now, because what happened next in that sunroom turned my first morning into the strangest and most dangerous day of my life, and you will want to be here when the rest of it unfolds. Caesar wiped his eye with one finger and asked, in accented English, who had taught me that saying. I told him the truth without thinking, because I was proud of it. My father, I said, Anton Marchetti. He used it every Sunday of my childhood. The laugh stopped. The warmth drained out of that lined face so fast I felt the temperature of the whole room drop with it. Emilio moved then. 2 quiet steps, and he was beside the old man's chair, and his voice was soft in the way knives are soft. He said my full name like he was reading it off a warrant, and told Salvatore that my employment was over, effective immediately, severance handled by the office. I stood there with coffee soaking through my apron, understanding nothing except that my father's name was a curse in this house. Caesar raised one hand, and the most feared nephew in New York stopped talking mid-sentence. The old man looked at me for a long time, and something moved behind those ancient eyes that I could not read. Then he said 2 words that changed the rest of my life. She stays. Emilio objected once, quietly, respectfully, the way you correct a king. Cesar never even turned his head. She stays. That afternoon, Emilio Corsini interviewed me in his study, the way a surgeon examines a lump. He had a file on his desk with my name on the tab, which told me he had started digging before my first breakfast was cold. He read my life back to me without emotion. The lease, the debt, the eviction, my mother's address, the fact that my father had been missing for 14 years. He missed nothing, and he wanted me to know it. He asked me what my father had told me about the Corsini family. I told him the truth. Nothing. Anton Marchetti walked out of our apartment in September of my 22nd year, and the only thing he left behind was a half-empty closet and a mother who stopped sleeping. Emilio watched my face the whole time I said it, hunting for the lie. There was no lie to find, and I think that bothered him most of all. Then he asked the question I had been asking myself all day. Why did I come here, to this house, of all the houses in New Jersey? I looked him in the eye and told him the ugly truth. Because I was drowning, because the agency paid cash, and because his family was the only one hiring a woman with judgments attached to her name. Desperation brought me to his door, not loyalty to a father I had not spoken to since I was 22. Something shifted in his face at the word desperation. He was quiet for a moment, turning a pen over in his fingers, and then he did the last thing I expected from a man like him. He had his office print a letter, sign it, and slide it across the desk. It guaranteed me the guest cottage on the estate for 30 days, paid in full, whether I stayed, quit, or was thrown out by the old man himself. I stared at that letter for a long time before I touched it. Men in my life had used my need like a leash. Dante used my signature. My father used my childhood. Now this dangerous stranger was handing me a piece of paper that said my shelter did not depend on pleasing anyone in this house. I asked him why. He said that a person who cannot leave cannot be trusted to stay. I did not understand yet how much of him lived inside that sentence. I moved into the cottage that evening, a small stone place behind the garden with its own key and its own lock, and I lay on a bed that was legally mine for 30 days and did not sleep, because one question kept circling in the dark. Cesare Corsini had not smiled in 14 years. My father disappeared 14 years ago. 2 clocks had stopped at the same moment, and somehow I was standing between them. The answer began 3 days later, in the old man's private sitting room. Salvatore asked me to help him air out the space, a wood-paneled room full of books no one read, and dust no one was allowed to touch. On the wall behind Cesar's chair hung photographs, and in the largest one, taken at some garden party 15 years earlier, I found a face I knew better than my own. My father. Younger, heavier, laughing at something outside the frame. But it was not his face that made my hands go cold. It was where he was standing. There were a dozen men in that photograph, soldiers and lieutenants, arranged in careful rows behind Cesare Corsini like a Renaissance painting of power. And my father, a civilian, an accountant's kind of man, stood beside the old Don at the same level, shoulder to shoulder, like a brother. Nobody stands beside a godfather by accident. Caesar found me staring at it. I never heard him come in, which was his particular talent. He stood in the doorway in his pale jacket, watching me look at the ghost on his wall, and his face was a locked room. I asked him the only question that mattered. How did he know my father? He looked at the photograph for a long moment, and then he told me to finish the dusting, and he walked away. The line went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Then Bianca told me she had never asked, not once, because the money was always good and she had been afraid of the answer. He called himself a financial consultant. He worked for companies with Italian names. That was all she knew. The next week settled into a strange rhythm of dusting, polishing, and being watched. Emilio's men were everywhere, courteous and silent, and I caught them reporting on me twice. But it was Emilio himself who surprised me, and it happened in the estate office on a Thursday. Paolo Ferraro, the family's 71-year-old bookkeeper, was struggling with some new accounting software, and two young associates were laughing at him behind their hands. Emilio came through the doorway like weather. He did not raise his voice. He asked the two young men whether they could reconcile 40 years of ledgers from memory the way Paolo could, and when they could not answer, he told them to leave. Then he picked up the heavy archive boxes Paolo had been straining to lift and carried them to the shelf himself, without ceremony, without looking to see who was watching. I was watching. That same week, he caught me watching something too. I was in the staff laundry at midnight, on the phone with my bank, moving money I did not have to cover my mother's prescription. I had skipped dinner 2 nights running to make the transfer work. I thought I was alone. When I hung up, Emilio was in the doorway with his jacket over his arm, and I could not tell how long he had been standing there. He did not comment on the tears I was hiding. He simply said that the kitchen kept a plate for me when I worked late, and that the cook had been insulted twice this week. Then he left. It was the first kindness he offered that did not look like a kindness, and I lay awake afterward wondering which was more dangerous to a woman like me, a man who used my weakness, or a man who quietly refused to. If you have ever had to decide whether decency from a dangerous man is real or just a longer leash, then you already understand the war that was starting inside me. Tell me in the comments whether you would have trusted that 30-day letter or handed it back and slept in your car. I know what I chose. Looking back now, from the far side of everything that letter set in motion, I am still not sure it was wisdom. The next crack in the mystery opened by accident, the way the worst ones do. I was sorting old household files for Salvatore, unpaid vendor bills and dead correspondence, when a letterhead I recognized made my stomach drop. It belonged to a private administrative office in Englewood Cliffs. 3 years earlier, that same office had paid 2 months of my rent, anonymously, 2 days before my eviction hearing. I had called it a miracle. It was not a miracle. I spent that night on my cottage floor with my old bank statements spread around me like a chalk outline. 3 times in 10 years, when eviction came close enough to touch, money had arrived from nowhere. Never enough to comfort me, always exactly enough to save me. I had thanked God, luck, and a clerical error, in that order. Now I had a letterhead, and it belonged to the Corsini family's private office. Fiatri Tumman is one more detail, and it was the one that kept me awake until dawn. The last payment had arrived 6 months before I walked through those iron gates. Then nothing. The help stopped the same season my life finished collapsing, almost as if someone had turned off a faucet and waited to see where the water would run. It ran straight here, to Villa Corsini, to a job that had appeared at the exact moment I had nowhere else to go. I took my suspicion to the one person in the house I could afford to offend. Salvatore found me in the sunroom before breakfast, holding the photograph down off the wall like evidence. I asked him plainly whether Cesare Corsini had been paying my rent. That old steward went pale, set down his silver, and told me the household money was none of my business, which, as you know, is how men say yes. So I went to the Godfather himself. I found him in the garden at dusk, alone with a glass of wine he was not drinking, and I did not ask permission to sit. I told him what I had found, and I asked him the question that had been growing teeth inside me for a week. Did you have my father killed? And have you been paying his debt to me ever since, in envelopes without a name? Cesar was silent for so long that the garden lights came on around us. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no anger at all, and that frightened me more than anger would have. He said that my father had betrayed him 14 years ago, and that this was true. Then he said the sentence that split my life into before and after. Whatever else I believed about this house, he said, I should believe one thing. Anton left here alive. For 14 years I had buried my father in a dozen different ways, and with one word, Cesar dug him up. I sat in that garden shaking, not from fear but from fury, because if Anton Marchetti left alive, then every birthday he missed was a decision. Every empty chair at every holiday table was a choice he kept making, year after year, while my mother pretended not to listen for the door. The proof of where he went arrived through Emilio, of all people. He came to my cottage one evening with a folder and an expression I had not seen on him before: hesitation. Inside the folder were records his investigators had pulled after Cesar's garden confession. A fishing license issued outside Palermo, Sicily, 11 years ago, in a name one letter different from my father's. A photograph, grainy, enlarged, of a gray-haired man buying oranges at a market. It was him, older, thinner, alive. My first thought was one I am ashamed of now. I decided Cesar had saved him. I built an entire story in my head where my father discovered something terrible, where the old Dons spirited him to Sicily to protect him, where the anonymous rent money was my father's payment flowing backward through Corsini hands. It was such a beautiful story. It let me keep a father who had loved me enough to disappear for my own good. I held on to it for 4 whole days. Then the employment agency called me back about a reference question, and the beautiful story caught fire. The woman on the phone, chatting, mentioned how unusual my placement had been. My application had actually been rejected in the first round, she said. Too much debt, a bad reference from the lease dispute. Then someone from a private administrative office in Inglewood Cliffs called personally and asked them to reopen my file and move it to the top. I sat down on my cottage bed with the phone still buzzing in my hand. The same office that had paid my rent had also built my cage. The payments stopped, my life collapsed on schedule, and a door into Cesar Corsini's house opened at the exact bottom of my fall. My homelessness had not been bad luck followed by luck. Somebody had starved me out on purpose and then laid a trail of breadcrumbs into this estate. I confronted Emilio that night in the middle of a thunderstorm, standing in his study soaking wet because I had run from the cottage through the rain. I threw the agency's name at him and accused him, accused his uncle, accused the entire house of purchasing my desperation and calling it employment. I watched his face while I did it, and what I saw there was not guilt, it was something colder. He was hearing it for the first time, and he was doing arithmetic. He told me to sit down and I refused, so he stood too, and for the first time he told me something instead of asking. The anonymous payments had been his uncle's, made from a personal account he had now verified, started the year after Anton vanished, but the account had not been closed by Cesar. It had been rerouted 6 months ago by the one man who controlled every piece of legacy correspondence in this family, Massimo Bellini. I knew Massimo only as the quiet advisor who moved through the estate like furniture. 61, soft-spoken, always carrying folders. I had served him coffee a dozen times. Once, weeks earlier, he had remarked that I must find Alpine more peaceful than my last address, and he had named my old street in Palisades Park. I had never told him my old street. Emilio's eyes changed when I said that out loud. He had not known Massimo knew it either. That was the night the mystery turned into a hunt. Emilio stopped treating me as a suspect and started treating me as the only other person in the house who wanted the truth more than self-preservation. We spent 3 evenings in his study over his ledgers and my memory, building a timeline on paper. Every coincidence I had lived through, he matched to an order, a transfer, a signature in Massimo Bellini's patient, boring handwriting. But the past still had one more blow to land, and Cesar delivered it himself. He called me to his sitting room on a Sunday morning, dismissed Salvatore, and told me to sit in the chair across from his, the chair where guests are judged. Then the godfather of the Corsini family finally told me what Anton Marchetti had done, 14 years ago, in the year the smile left his face. My father had not been a soldier. He had been something rarer in that world and far more trusted. He was Cesare's civilian financial strategist, the brilliant, ordinary man in the plain suit who kept the family's legitimate businesses clean and growing. Cesare called him the brother he chose, rather than the one he inherited. Together they had built a web of companies, and some of those companies were jointly owned with another old family, the Bellafortes. 14 years ago, auditing the shared books, my father found rot. The Bellafortes had buried enormous private debts inside the jointly owned businesses, quietly arranging for Corsini companies to absorb losses that could have ruined both families if they surfaced. It was the kind of discovery that ends partnerships and starts wars. Anton brought it to no one, not to Cesar, who loved him. He took it to the Bellafortes instead, and he sold it. They paid him to disappear and stay silent. Enough money to vanish well, to Sicily, to a gray-haired man buying oranges under a name with one letter changed. He left Cesar holding contaminated companies he did not yet know were poisoned. He left my mother clerking double shifts. He left me at 22, and he never once came back, not because he could not, but because the money was easier than our faces. Cesar finished the story with his hands folded and his eyes on the photograph behind me, and I understood at last why the smile had died. He had not lost an enemy. He had lost the one man outside his blood he had ever trusted, and that man had priced their friendship and cashed it. The godfather had not been grieving a death for 14 years. He had been grieving a price tag. I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Why the rent money, then? Why me? Cesar's voice did not change, but his eyes did, and for a second he looked every one of his 79 years. He found out what Anton had done after the fact, too late to stop it. He could not punish a ghost, so he had watched the ghost's daughter nearly lose her home, and he had helped, in secret, because shame is easier to mail than an apology. He told me the money was never repayment for Anton. It was for me and my mother, because we had paid for a betrayal we did not commit. He had never once knocked on our door, because facing us meant facing what his blindness had cost. I want to tell you I forgave him. I did not. I thanked him for the truth, and walked out while a godfather sat alone with the mess he had finally admitted making. 2 days after Cesare's confession, Emilio called me to his study and closed the door, and his face told me the hunt had ended. He had the whole mechanism now, in Massimo Bellini's own records. Massimo had learned years earlier that Anton occasionally sent word through a Palermo intermediary, an old priest, asking only whether Serena and Bianca were safe. My father never called. He never wrote. He kept one thin thread tied to us, checking we were alive, like a man testing locks he had no right to open. Massimo had been the one reading that thread. He had controlled the private office, the payments, the correspondence, all of it. And 6 months ago he had made his move. He stopped Cesare's assistance without telling him, watched my situation collapse exactly as predicted, and then reopened my rejected application and steered me into this house. Why? because the Bellaforte alliance was up for renewal, worth millions, and Massimo's own reputation was welded to keeping the old financial deception buried. And here is the part that turned my blood to ice water. Massimo had leaked word through the Palermo Channel that Anton's daughter was now living inside the Corsini estate. He was using me as bait in a trap he never had to touch. Anton would panic. Anton would break 14 years of silence and reach for Cesare directly. And Massimo would trace that contact to its source, find the only living witness to the original fraud, and make sure my father never spoke before the renewal was signed. The renewal was in 4 days. I stood in Emilio's study, understanding that a quiet man with folders had rearranged my entire life as casually as I arranged his coffee service, and that every person he had used, me, Cesar, even my coward of a father, was expected to behave predictably. I asked Emilio what he intended to do. He looked at me for a long moment, and he said that was not his decision alone to make. Then he asked me what I wanted. That question undid me more than any threat had. I wanted Massimo destroyed. I wanted my father to answer for 14 years of silence. I wanted, God help me, for none of it to be true. Emilio listened without moving, and then he said the thing that separates him from every man who had ever failed me. He said he would not use my father's location, my mother's safety, or my debt as pieces on his board. And whatever happened next, I would see every record he saw. The morning of the renewal, Villa Corsini filled with black cars and men who smiled without warmth. The Bellafortes came with lawyers and briefcases. Emilio came with a single folder. And before one contract page was turned, in the same dining room where my first tray had fallen, Emilio asked Cesar, Massimo, and me to sit, and he laid Massimo's own records on the polished table 1 sheet at a time, like he was dealing cards at a funeral. Massimo did not deny any of it. That is what I will remember longest. He straightened his tie and defended himself with the calm of a man reading a grocery list. Serena was never physically harmed, he said. The payments were Cesar's money, freely given. The job had given me shelter when I had none. Anton was a threat to both families. The alliance was worth millions. He looked around that table, genuinely puzzled, and asked what exactly he was accused of when the plan had worked. I have heard cruel men raise their voices, and selfish men tell pretty lies. I have never heard anything as frightening as Massimo's reasonableness. My eviction, my mother's worry, my father's panic, Cesar's guilt, all of it was acceptable collateral to him, because the numbers balanced. He had reduced every soul at that table to a lever, and he truly, sincerely could not see why pulling levers was wrong. Emilio let him finish. Then he stood, walked to where the Bellaforte representatives waited in the hall, and in front of everyone he closed the negotiation. No renewal, no alliance, not now, not on these terms, not built on a foundation of hidden debts and hidden people. I watched millions of dollars walk out of that house because a mafia boss refused to leave me standing on a chessboard. Massimo's plan did not fail loudly. It simply lost everything it was built to protect in one quiet sentence. The Godfather did not rage. Cesar looked at the man who had served him for decades and removed him the way a surgeon removes dead tissue. Massimo Bellini was stripped of the private office, the accounts, the correspondence, the negotiations, and his keys to the estate, all before lunch. No violence. In that family, total exclusion from trust was the execution. He walked out through the same iron gates I had entered, carrying one box, and nobody watched him go. And then, in the terrible silence he left behind, Cesar's private line began to ring. It was a line almost no living person had the number to. Cesar looked at the phone, then at me, and his face did something I had never seen it do. It asked my permission. He lifted the receiver, listened for one moment, and held it out across the desk. Emilio did not reach for it. Salvatore did not breathe. The Godfather gave the phone to me. My father's voice was older, and his accent had gone soft, but I knew it before he finished my name. He talked the way drowning men swim, all direction and no breath. The Bellafortes had frightened him. He believed disappearing would end the danger for all of us. He told himself we would recover, that we were better off, and every year he stayed away. Coming home grew heavier, until the weight of it crushed the father I remembered into a stranger buying oranges under a borrowed name. I let him finish, and then I told him the truest thing I have ever said out loud. Fear explained why he considered leaving. Money explained why he accepted. But 14 years gone was not one decision made in a panic. It was 5,000 mornings of choosing, again and again, to stay gone. I would not turn him into a tragic hero of a mafia story, and I would not forgive him just because a phone call finally cost him something. I did not curse him. I did not promise never to speak to him again, because I refused to build my life out of doors slammed shut. I told him that if he ever wanted to know me, he could start by telling my mother the truth with his own mouth, and then we would see what was left to build on. He wept. I did not. I handed the phone back to Cesar, and for the first time in that house, I felt my feet entirely under me. Before I left that room, Cesare asked me to stay one moment more, and the godfather of the Corsini family apologized to his housemaid. Not for helping me, for hiding. He said his money had let him ease his conscience without ever facing mine, and that this was a cowardice he was too old to excuse and not too old to stop. He asked for nothing back. Men had spent my whole life attaching strings to every kindness, and this old man cut his own off in front of me. I resigned from Villa Corsini at the end of that week, not because Emilio asked me to stay, and not because anyone in that house had failed me at the end, but because a woman who is rescued into comfort is still a woman someone else is carrying. I took the bookkeeping skills I had owned long before I ever wore an apron, and I found work with a small accounting firm in Fort Lee that cared about my ledgers and not my last name. It took me 11 months. 11 months of structured payments on the lease debt, of my mother's Sunday sauce, of a studio apartment in Ridgefield with a key that belonged to me and a lock no one else could open. The first night I slept there, on a mattress on the floor, in a room smaller than my cottage bathroom had been, I slept better than I had in 14 years. Nobody could take it from me for disappointing them. Ninmai se tolmai, Emilio called me exactly twice in those 11 months. Once to ask permission to call again. Once to tell me my mother had received a letter from Palermo and had chosen on her own to answer it. He never offered to pay my debt. He never sent a car I did not request. A man whose entire world ran on control handed me the one thing that world considers a weakness, the power to leave him, and then he waited to see what I would do with it. This story began with a godfather's smile, and it is about to end with one. If you have stayed with me through every twist, take 1 second now to subscribe and like this video, because stories like this one are why this channel exists, and I promise the last minute of mine is worth that small click. And tell me in the comments, did I do right by my father, or would you have closed that door forever? What I did with it in the end was this. On a Thursday evening in October, I called Emilio Corsini myself, and I invited him to dinner at my apartment, on my street, in a building he did not own. The first time I entered his world, I had nowhere else on earth to go. The first time he entered mine, I was a woman who could have lived perfectly well without him, and that is exactly why choosing him meant something. Cesara came too, that night, gray and quiet in the elevator, with a bottle of wine older than my career. We ate at my second-hand table, the 3 of us, and my mother sent her blessing and her eggplant and stayed home, because some reunions she was not ready for, and that too was a choice I had learned to respect. Emilio broke bread and scattered crumbs across the clean cloth I had just ironed, entirely careless, entirely at home. I gave him the look my father used to earn, and I said it without thinking. Cumancia fe mudici, who eats makes crumbs. And Cesar Corsini laughed, deep and helpless and young, and smiled the second real smile of my knowing him. 14 years ago, those words had reminded him of the friend who sold him. Now they belonged to a woman who had followed the crumbs all the way back through the dark and come out the other side owning herself, because that is what I finally understand about the saying. Everyone who eats leaves crumbs. Everyone who chooses leaves traces. Anton left his and ran. Massimo left his in other people's suffering. Cesare left his in envelopes without a name. Emilio left his in every door he opened and refused to lock behind me. And I left mine in a Sicilian sentence spoken over a fallen tray, in a house built on silence, On the morning a godfather remembered how to smile.